there, welcome to the in-service on abuse and neglect. This is one of the important mandatory in-services that we do both when a person first begins work at Allumé and then at least annually, or if ever there is a moment in time when this subject comes up and a person might need to be re-educated. So please pay extra close attention to what you learn in this presentation, as it is extremely important to the people we serve. So abuse and neglect. So this is a known tremendous problem in home health care. It affects thousands of people every single year. What we know is that signs of abuse are often not seen and therefore goes unreported or undealt with. Abuse can be an extension of potential dysfunction in a home or a result of changes related to the stress of having a dependent at home, or someone who needs a higher level of care than they may have in the past, or just in general, right? We have a lot of patients who have a high level of care. So home care employees are in a very unique situation to identify and report situations where abuse might be happening. And abuse is not always clear, right? We might have situations where we see things aren't happening the way we would do it in the home, and that is different, right? That's judging others for the way they're choosing to live their lives versus what's truly abuse and neglect. So that's something that when you're in the field, it's very important to really understand the differences, as well as to have regular dialogues with the other nurses that you're working with to talk about it and help discern what's abuse and neglect and what's just differences in the way people interact. Abuse defined: the willful infliction of physical pain or injury, or the willful deprivation by a caregiver of services which are necessary to the person's health or safety. Okay, so that's the definition. It also includes the use of offensive language or the act to provoke or upset an individual or subject him to humiliation or ridicule. So that's not okay either. So this is all under the umbrella of abuse. Who's at risk for abuse? People of all ages are affected by abuse and neglect. So children is an especially vulnerable population. Any person under the age of 18, abused or neglected by a parent, caregiver, adult in their community, anyone with authority over them could potentially abuse or neglect them. The elderly are also very vulnerable. Adult children and spouses are the most frequent abusers of the elderly. Very sad as that might seem, these things do happen. Persons with physical and intellectual disabilities are very vulnerable, and mental health and addiction clients also. Abuse and neglect is very common. It's very unfortunate that there's a lot of judgment placed on people with mental health and addiction challenges, and also persons with physical and intellectual disabilities. There can be judgments and that lead to abuse and neglect. So some risk factors. So dependence on other people, caregivers, for their daily living activities, right? If you have somebody in that situation, which many, if not most of our patients are, then there is a risk with that. If someone who is socially isolated, multiple medical problems, someone with an elderly person caring for another elderly person, right? Because if it's, they may feel overwhelmed by the responsibility and incapable and have other challenges they're dealing with that lead to them not being able to manage the care. Cognitive impairment. Someone with cognitive impairment or someone around a person with cognitive impairment. Caregiver stress, burnout, really big factor. History of family violence, lack of resources, right? Because that turns up the stress. Substance abuse, Increased dependency on a caregiver. So if someone suddenly has a stroke and now they're home and they have to have a lot of care, but in the past they weren't, that can increase the risk for abuse. Types of abuse: physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional, verbal abuse, neglect, exploitation, and abandonment. So physical abuse is use of physical force that would cause bodily injury, pain, or impairment. Things that you would think about would be striking, slapping, shaking, pushing, kicking, burning, restraining, and improper medication administration is also under this area of physical abuse. The abused person may be withdrawn, fearful, or anxious around a caregiver, so that's something to watch for. A warning sign might be denial of visitors without the caregiver being present. Okay, so that could also be, if the caregiver requires that the nurse that they be present when someone else comes to the home, then that could be a warning sign. So watch for that. Indicators of possible physical abuse or neglect, as the physical things you might see: bruising, burns, lacerations, etc. If you see that somebody's not getting all of their medications, or perhaps too much, unexplained difficulty walking, sitting, or sleeping, or weight loss, dehydration, malnutrition, all these things are indicators to watch for. Sexual abuse is the next area of abuse to look at, and it's sexual contact or encouragement of sexual contact between a paid or volunteer staff and an individual, regardless of consent. So you are not allowed to have any kind of sexual connection with your patients, full stop. That is considered sexual abuse, even if the patient is the one who is initiating it. It is considered sexual abuse, and it is not allowed. It is very, very, very not allowed. Sexual contact or encouragement of sexual activity with someone who cannot consent is always considered abuse. That's also important. Emotional abuse defined: so causing anguish, pain, or distress through verbal or nonverbal actions. Examples are insults, threats, intimidation, humiliation. Isolation of the person from the family, friends, or regular activities could also constitute emotional abuse. So indicators: there could be ambivalence or deference or passivity by the patient. Explicit or observed fear of a caregiver. Hesitation to talk openly about what's going on for them. Implausible or conflicting stories. They're telling you things that you know don't quite add up for how they got a bump, or it doesn't all make sense. Or this is emotional, but just implausible or conflicting stories that make you think that somebody's not being kind to them. Anger, denial, or non-responsiveness, anxiety, agitation, sleeplessness, lots of self-soothing behaviors. So sucking, biting, rocking, things like that. You see that with developmentally disabled, as well as children, as well as adults, but just to watch those kinds of behaviors. Neglect. So we talk about abuse and neglect. So neglect is defined here: failure to provide needed care. Care which is necessary to maintain physical and or mental health, or failure to arrange such necessary services by a caregiver. The lack of care may be intentional or unintentional. And I really feel like neglect can sometimes be where we run into gray areas. It all can, but some less pronounced than others. This is more in the gray. So this can include medical neglect, inadequate supervision, lack of basic needs such as food, water, clothing, and shelter. Physical indicators of possible neglect: soiled, torn, improperly worn, or inappropriate clothing could be signs. Skin breakdown, right, for those who are in a hospital bed a lot of the time. Odor of human waste, wandering, absence of functional aids, weight loss, dehydration, untreated medical conditions, or injuries. Want to watch for those things in the field for sure. Environmental signs is excrement, plumbing or heating problems. It's freezing cold. where there's nowhere to use the latrine, right? Lots of trash, infestation of mice, rodents, etc., bugs. Expired medications. Somebody's not taking their meds if they're all expired. Absent or spoiled food. No telephone or emergency call system. So just these are things to watch for. Process of, so exploitation, here is the next area here, and this is the definition. It's the process of taking advantage of a person for monetary, personal, or other benefit, gain, or profit. So indicators of exploitation might be sudden isolation from family or friends, sudden changes in lifestyle, loss of valuable possessions, right? Suddenly, things are missing from their home. Expensive gifts from client to caregivers is not allowed. That's it can be considered exploitation. Recent acquaintances express excessive affection. Again, that can be considered exploitation. Caregiver seeks exchange of assets for care. Again, very, very, have to be very careful about that. Forced signatures, right? You have to sign this. I was here at this time and you really weren't, or whatever. That kind of thing is considered exploitation. Accusations from one family member against another can be a potential area of exploitation. Client confusion as to disappearing assets. That would be a possible exploitation. Change in stable banking relationship. So that would be something if you notice that suddenly they've got issues or they have stacks of bills that are coming in. Sudden increase in debt. Again, something might be affecting them, right? Someone might be exploiting them. So financial exploitation, things to watch for: unpaid bills, shut-off notices, frequent checks made out to cash. Watch for that. Bounced checks, absent or confused information about finances, charitable giving that exceeds resources. That doesn't make sense, right? Somebody might be pushing them to do things with their money that they aren't in their best interest. Personal belongings or credit cards suddenly come missing, or caregiver name added to a bank account. That could be a problem, right? So these are just things to just sort of notice, right? Bring it up to your supervisor for sure. Abandonment, another area. The willful forsaking or desertion of a person by the caregiver, neglect of those duties by the caregiver or the other responsible person. So abandonment. Child abuse and neglect. Here's another one. So child abuse, physical injury, not necessarily visible, or a child under circumstances that indicate that the child's health or welfare is harmed or at substantial risk of being harmed. So that's something that we always want to look for and be very, very mindful about, right? And certainly my suggestion to you is let's not talk to your supervisor if you believe this is happening. These are things that need to be thought through very carefully. Child neglect, the failure to give proper care and attention to a child, including the leaving of a child unattended under circumstances that indicate the child's health or welfare is harmed or placed at substantial risk of harm. So they're left alone inappropriately. Sometimes this can be an area of gray, right? So what might be okay for one family might not be okay for you or your family. So these are can be shades of gray and should definitely be discussed with your supervisor should you come upon it, and think about how to strategize to overcome it or what to do about it. Facts about elder abuse. So elder abuse can occur in all families regardless of income. It's across all the spectrum of race, gender, income. It happens in lots of conditions. 2/3 of elder abuse occurs by family members, right? Which is hard to believe, but it's also, it's very stressful, right? When you have suddenly someone who is incapacitated who wasn't before. That's stressful. Elder abuse can be masked by certain disease common to the elderly, so sometimes we don't see it. Caregiver stress can lead to abuse, and not turning a bed-bound patient is a form of neglect or abuse. So making sure that their skin is not breaking down, making sure that their bodies get moved appropriately is a form of abuse. So reporting abuse and neglect is something that we have to be thoughtful about. Possible indicators of abuse or neglect may not always turn out to be abuse, but are always important to evaluate. So the mandated reporter must have a reasonable suspicion that an individual has been mistreated. No evidence of proof is required. So mandated reporters, who are these people? Connecticut has developed a list of professionals who are mandated to report any suspected abuse or neglect. So all of you out in the field are mandated reporters: doctors, nurses, social workers, therapists, etc., police officers, clergymen. So any person paid for providing care to patients, home health aides, by any institution, organization, agency, or facility, everyone in the office, right, who is on the phone and starts to hear about things that you're questioning. So any employee of a community-based service provider, that is us. Senior center, home care agency, us. Homemaker companion agency, and EMS personnel. So you're on the hook. We're on the hook. Mandated reporting continued says any person who makes any report cannot be held liable. Failure to report is considered a misdemeanor. There is no one centralized agency in the state of Connecticut report abuse, which is fascinating. Important to follow policies within the agency to protect you and us. So all cases of suspected abuse and or neglect will be reported and investigated promptly. So my recommendation to you, because our policy is for you is to tell your supervisor and escalate it if needed from the supervisor on up to the administrator or to myself, however needs to go. Do that, because then you can decide together and decide what to do about it, and whether it does need to be reported beyond just to our in-house team. So all cases of suspected abuse and or neglect will be reported and investigated promptly in compliance with the state law and regulations. Reporter will be required to provide their information. However, reporters may request anonymity, and reporters are under no legal obligation to inform parents. So report anything that's alleged, suspected, or witnessed to a supervisor immediately. And that is the best way to protect the patient as well as yourself. Who do I report to? Okay. So there are 3 major agencies that handle investigations of abuse and neglect. So who you call is based on the age and diagnosis as follows. So anyone under the age of 18 should be reported. The report should be made to DCF, Department of Children and Family. So DCF Caroline and or law enforcement agency. So we can go to either one. An oral report should be made within 12 hours and written report should be submitted within 48 hours. So anyone with an intellectual disability from ages 18 to 59 should have the report made to the Office of Protection and Advocacy. So those are supposed to be reported within 72 hours and written within 5 days. Anyone over 60 should have the report made to the Connecticut Department of Social Services, Protective Services for the Elderly, either one. An oral report must be made within 72 hours and written report to follow within 5 days. So your supervisor will assist you in making reports to external authorities. Very important. Please do not just go and do this on your own. The policy is for you to partner with us and we can do it together. When and what do I report? The sooner a report is made, the sooner it can be investigated. It is helpful to gather information. They will request and call as soon as you can. So they're going to ask for their name, their age, their gender of the alleged victim, as well as the name and address of the caregiver. or whoever might be involved in the abuse or neglect. The extent of the maltreatment or neglect, the approximate date and time such maltreatment or neglect occurred, and any past abuse neglect you are aware of for this individual, any other data that might contribute to make you believing that this is indeed maltreatment or neglect, and any other information. So this will be the information that you'll want to gather and have when you make a report. The next topic is retaliation and whistleblower protection. So a whistleblower is someone who has knowledge of corruption, unethical practices, violation of laws, mismanagement, gross waste of funds, abuse of authority, or danger to the public safety, according to any state department or agency, quasi-public agency, or any state contract. So someone with knowledge about something that's going on that shouldn't, basically. A whistleblower is someone who decides to say, I see that there's something going wrong and I'm going to report it. I'm going to blow a whistle. So the Connecticut law protects whistleblowers from retaliation or threats of retaliation for having made the report. So we're now going to talk through a couple different scenarios to see whether or not the scenario is reportable. So here's the scenario. Someone you're working with tells you how sorry they are for being in a wheelchair and needing help. When you ask them why they're upset, they tell you that they heard their mother tell someone on the phone, "It can just be so hard with all these medical needs, I feel like I can't keep up." So you hear this happening. When you ask them what they're upset about, they tell you that they've heard this. So is this an example of abuse and neglect? No. Although what was said may have been hurtful to the patient, it simply was a comment, and the comment was not meant to provoke or upset an individual or subject him to her or her to humiliation or ridicule. So therefore, this would not be a reportable event. Next scenario. During a home visit, you notice that there is extra medication in a patient's pillbox. Their daughter typically visits daily after work to dispense the medication to assure it's taken accurately. Might be interesting to take a look at them at their medication administration record, right, and see if what they've done. So you ask your patient about it, and they tell you that their daughter forgot to stop by to give their medication to her. She's been really busy. And this has happened more than once. Is this reportable? Yes. Failure to supply necessary food, clothing, shelter, and medical care when reasonably able to do so is considered neglect and is reportable. So somebody misses at one time, probably not, right? Unless it's like really, it's something life or death. Something that happens all the time, is happening regularly, this is reportable. Is this reportable? You're helping an elderly patient when you notice large bruises on their upper arm. When you inquire about the origin of those bruises, your patient tells you it's nothing. Don't worry about it. When you ask her daughter, she denies having any knowledge of where the bruises came from. Is this reportable? Yes. Any physical or mental injury not reasonably explained by the patient's history of injuries is considered an injury of unknown origin and should be reported for potential abuse. Okay? All right, another one. An individual you're working with loves dancing. You learn that their in-home staff member has been taking videos of them dancing and sending them to their friends because they're so funny. Your patient thinks that staff thinks they're a good dancer, but you realize the staff is making fun of your patient. Reportable? Yes, and not HIPAA compliant. That's a different story. But yes, this is reportable. The staff member is behaving in a way that subjects him or her to humiliation or ridicule. Also, it is illegal to tape someone without their consent. And if your patient is a minor or has a conservator, they cannot give you permission to publicly share them on video. So just be aware of that. So you've just completed this video on abuse and neglect. I hope that it helps clarify and bring to mind what your responsibilities are, and that you will keep a bright eye out into the field to make sure our patients are safe. Thank you for taking the time to listen, and go make the world a better place.